Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. It's a lovely way to start a Monday, having a conversation with everybody. And we've decided to keep this quite an informal conversation today about things you need to know about anti-money laundering legislation and buying art. I'm really fortunate today to be joined by Susan J. Mumford, who is the, are you director or CEO of ArtAML?
Well, both. So, and
Yeah.
co-founder. So quite a few different ways of describing it.
Yeah. So Susan has an awful lot of knowledge and expertise in this area and is somebody who I've worked with quite closely in getting to understand the regulations of buying art and anti-money laundering. The reason why I wanted to do this session today is that Parapluie, my company, which is a company that sources contemporary art for a range of clients, including interior designers and architects, we're a member of the British Institute of Interior Design industry providers, industry sector membership. And it's something that I was kind of aware with talking to interior designers that they weren't entirely fully briefed or understood the implications of the new regulations that have come into law now about sourcing artwork for interiors. And what we're going to talk to, we're going to keep it quite informal today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I work with interior designers, and then I'm going to hand over to Susan, who's going to talk you through what it means for interior designers in terms of sourcing art for your clients. So to start off, Parapluie is my company that I've been running approximately 4 years. Before that, I worked in museums and galleries and worked with collectors and collections for 25 years. And Parapluie sources artwork for a number of different types of clients. It could be collectors of art. It could be individuals looking for something for their home that's about a personal engagement with work, or looking to start buying small pieces for their home. Or we can work in a kind of B2B level where we work with interior designers and architects on sourcing art. So I have a range of clients, but fundamentally the processes are very much the same in buying art. And often interior designers come to us looking to source art for their clients, and we work alongside the interior designers in doing so. Buying art is not quite as simple as it often would appear with other forms of fixtures and fittings that interior designers need to be sourcing. And what's kind of important to say at this point is that art is now subject to anti-money laundering regulation. And we're not talking about, for example, works of, 6 figures and above, or great masterpieces or hidden old masters. We're talking about the general purchasing of artwork is now subject to anti-money laundering legislation. So when I'm sourcing work for clients and interior designers, one of the issues that I talk about with them is this very fact that is now a regulatory demand of people buying art that they are part of this. So as an art advisory, we are registered with HMRC as an art market participant, and we've had to go through training, and we had to produce policies, and Susan can talk about this because we worked closely with Susan on this. And we have to regularly retrain on anti-money laundering regulations, and we have to annually subscribe to HMRC and to a secure cloud-based system for registering information on clients. This is incredibly important that we do this. The art market in itself is deemed as one of the areas where there has been in the past a number of incidents, and has been quite unregulated in the past, and the government was very keen to close the loophole on who was buying art and who was, where the money is coming from. And Susan can talk a bit more about this. So it is very different to other areas of other types of fixtures and fittings you might be sourcing for. And part of this is to know where the money is coming to purchasing the work, and also who is purchasing the work. And this becomes very much, the reason why I was quite keen to run this today is, particularly in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I have been called on quite a number of times to sign up to presentations and webinars that have been held by HMRC around the sanctions that are related to Russia. So how are we complying with the sanctions that are happening? Are we checking our clients to make sure that this is not an area where they are funneling money? Who is buying the art? Do you have Russian clients? Is the art going to Russia? I mean, it's endless. It's endless in terms of those kind of sanctions. And it's something that everyone now can see is obviously happening with the current conflict in Ukraine. So it's really important that we comply with those regulations. But this legislation has been in place now for nearly 2 years, and Susan will talk more about those dates. So it isn't just applying to obviously the sanctions that are placed on Russia. It applies to anyone buying art, and it's something that we have to do. So Susan's I'm going to do an introduction to Susan, and Susan's going to talk through the rules and regulations, and then we're going to have a conversation about what I do when I'm sourcing work and how it then applies to the system so you can understand it. And we can also have a Q&A at the end, so you can get an understanding of anything that you're not sure about. So I'm going to hand over to Susan. As I said, Susan is the co-founder of ArtAML and has been absolutely vital in Parapluie's understanding of anti-money laundering legislation and holding our hand through the whole process. So I'm incredibly grateful for Susan for joining us today, particularly because she knows this area inside out, and I'm still learning and I'm working in it. So it's really great that we've got her today. So I'm going to hand over to Susan, and you can talk a little bit about this new legislation for interior designers and, well, anyone working in the art market.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Julia, and for Parapluie for inviting me to come along. I'll give a bit about my own background so that people understand that context, which is that I very much so do understand the art market in and out. So I'll read my intro basically for you. So I'm a sector supporting entrepreneur for the industry. Having arrived from the USA to the UK in 2000, I ran a gallery in Soho in London from 2006 to 2011. I was basically an art dealer and advisor over a 10-year period. When the art world entered a new era following the credit crunch, which some people will remember perhaps painfully like me, I founded the Association of Women Art Dealers. That's an international not-for-profit multi-chapter network that connects women and women identifying art dealers on a global basis. That was then followed by the creation of Be Smart About Art, which is an online accessible professional development program, and that helps art market, particularly small business owners, thrive in this very rapidly changing sector. And then in 2018, co-founded ArtAML, and we essentially provide this full circle solution. And I'll be giving you context today, particularly for the lens of the interior designer and how it might apply. The term art market participant you wouldn't think would apply to an interior designer, but it does. And HMRC has very specifically named interior designers in a piece of risk guidance in 2021. And on that note, we do regularly engage with the civil service to help, essentially to help inform and kind of act as an in-between between the sector and the civil service to help and support to build something that achieves the aims of the government, which would be to prevent your businesses from being the target of money laundering and terrorist financing activities, all the while, if that is present, that you would be able to identify it. So what I'm going to do now is share a little presentation to give an overview of the landscape specifically for interior designers, and then we'll head back into a little chat. So at any points, questions, I know Julia's keeping an eye on the chat room, please pop those in there as well. Right, so let's say that you think, okay, am I an art market participant or not? There's 3 qualifiers to be an art market participant, and you'll start to see how this applies potentially to interior designers. So you have a value of an art transaction that's 10,000 or more euros. That's approximately £8,300. The item being, in your case, sold to a client is deemed to be a work of art, and that's according to the VAT Act 1994, and you're operating as an art market participant. Now, what do these things mean? The next several slides will go into some detail. So if we look at this, qualifier 1 of 3, how is that 10,000 euros calculated? The amount is per transaction and not necessarily the piece of art. If the payment's being made in several parts, it's the total amount that applies. That might, for example, in fact, be a commission, which can often apply for interior design projects. Then we have the total invoice value is that applicable amount. That includes VAT and the directly associated items. So think about it being the amount of money that's being moved. That's the reason that you need to include that tax figure. And this I've specifically added in context for yourselves. The applicable amount is not your commission, but the transaction value, i.e. what the client pays. So even if you're acting as an intermediary, then let's say you're taking 10%, it's the transaction value that applies and not your commission. And FY, the official currency conversion for euros to British pounds is the gov.uk monthly calculator, which by the by lives on artaml.com. We always update that each month, and that sits in our knowledge base. Right, so then what then is a work of art? I could spend the next 15 minutes walking you through this. So instead of doing that, what I have done is I've provided here a link, artaml.io/VAT Act 1994, and that will take you to a page actually by the government. And what it does not include is what I've presented here today. It's most of what you would expect, photography and sculptures and paintings. Pieces in larger editions, you can dig into detail in the definition itself. Digital art, video, and NFTs. If you think about it, the VAT Act dates to 1994, hence those latter three items not being included. And we do expect the UK government to eventually catch up to the way that the contemporary art market works, but it's not there quite yet. So qualifier 3 of 3 is, are you yourself operating as an art market participant? Well, according to the Money Laundering Regulations, and that is the law to which the art market or art market participants need to comply, and it's amendment number 1511 from 2019. An art market participant is a firm or sole practitioner, so you could be a limited company, you could be a sole trader, who trades in or acts as an intermediary in the sale or purchase of works of art, and the value of the transaction or a series of linked transactions, hence that comment on commissions, is 10,000 euros or more. So that word intermediary is even in the definition. This is the risk guidance to which I previously referred. It states, an interior designer could be an app, that's an art market participant, as they could be acting as an intermediary. This would depend on what the interior designer's working agreement is with their customer. If the interior designer is buying the art on behalf of their customer, they will have to declare who their customer is to the selling app, so they conduct the right CDD. And this is where we start to get into acronyms. So that stands for customer due diligence. And it's, by the way, more than just taking a photo ID and proof of address. That's what some people think that customer due diligence is. It's far more comprehensive. So let's look at this delineation between intermediary and introducer. Now, there's not yet anything official in writing. So what I have done for you to help you understand this is I've presented to you the notes verbatim that I took in a meeting with a regulator. This is not officially approved. This is when I was learning what on earth the difference is myself, and it took me months and months to get my own head around this. I wrote, if an AMP, art market participant, is negotiating paperwork, percentage, etc., they're involved in the sale, they are an AMP. If they're active, then they're an AMP. Active, and I thought this was really important, negotiating, arranging something that affects the sale of the work of that work of art. The difference then is if you are purely being an introducer, in the sense of you say, oh, Julia, I've got this collector, and I've been doing the interior design job for them. They have really specialist needs, and essentially I think you're just perfectly situated to help them meet so-and-so, over to you, and you step out of the situation. You're not negotiating, you're not arranging, you're not doing something that is affecting that sale. You're just saying, let me introduce you to Julia, and then you entirely step out of that conversation. You could still take commission, but you wouldn't be involved at all. Now, in terms of what is entailed, and I know this is one of the things that Julia was going, my gosh, interior designers doing all of this, and it's so much more than what acquiring a work of art was a number of years ago. Because in order to continue transacting at that level of 10,000 euros, about £8,300 or more, you need to register as an art market participant with HMRC, and you don't do any further transactions before you do that, because otherwise you would be breaking the law and you could be subject to some pretty hefty fines. You need to undertake a risk assessment for your business that identifies how your business could be the target of money laundering or terrorist financing activities. From the risk assessment, then you need to create a policy, and that contains what's called your policies, controls, and procedures. And that document outlines how to mitigate those risks. So basically, yes, there are overarching concerns about how the art market could be targeted by, say, criminals, but how could your individual business be at risk? Is there a particular jurisdiction with which you're regularly transacting? Are there particular factors, maybe types of items being acquired? You also need to undergo AML training, and all of these need to be kept current, by the way. So the best practice is once a year, you're refreshing your risk assessment and your policy, and you're refreshing your training. And there are costs, obviously, to all of this each year. Number 5 is you're conducting AML or compliance checks for qualifying transactions. And that's what I was saying was more than just a photo ID and proof of address. And then you need to store the data that's been collected in association with that compliance check for a minimum of 5 years. And of course, you need to then hold that data, and because there is personal data included, some of the most sensitive data in terms of, say, hackery, you need to put that according to UK GDPR. If you look at a platform like ours, that's one of the things that we're doing, is helping to keep that secure for your collectors, your clients. Oops. Probably a little bit keen there. Let me go back to the previous one. Submit any suspicious activity to the National Crime Agency. So that is what the person in your business called the nominated officer does. And what I say at the bottom is what I said before, which is needing to keep all of that up to date. So last several points. What are then the annual costs of doing this? The cost to register and then annually renew is £300 per premises, and then £40 per responsible person. So if there were a couple of you in the business, say, that were directors who would jointly be responsible for this, then that might take you up to £380 for the initial registration and then renewal each year, because it's the 300 plus the 40 per person. And that's the basics in terms of interior designers. And it's something that is definitely to be seriously taken. We've just been learning what the fines for non-registration are. And if you should have been registered at some point in time, then basically an HMRC, say, goes out to you and says, hey, oi, you've been transacting at this level, and you don't go up to them first, they'll fine you for £5,000 per quarter that you should have been registered. But if you register yourself and you go, oh my gosh, I should be doing this, they'll give you 50% discount. If you pay within 28 days, they'll give you a further 25% discount. So you can see the government's really now proceeding with taking it seriously, and it's been a challenging implementation period because of the pandemic. And HMRC, as the regulator, they did take it lightly at the beginning, just because everyone was really trying to work on their businesses and work out how on earth did they need to adapt to survive the pandemic. So Julia, back to you.
Thanks, Susan. I just wanted to pull out a few bits of your presentation to sort of help maybe elaborate on some of those points that you talked about. When you talked about multiple payments for a work, so this could be, for example, if a client wants you to source 3 works for a room, but where the transaction would go beyond that amount, isn't it? So it's not necessarily the payment of one piece, but it could be that in that agreement with a client, they want 3 works for the room, or they want 3 works for the ground floor, or X, Y, and if that comes over that qualifying amount, that's classed as one transaction, isn't it?
It is. And what we have in the art market is called occasional transactions, as opposed to, say, in the legal industry, a law firm has what's called ongoing business relationships. So even if you are transacting with a client again and again, you wouldn't necessarily have an ongoing business relationship. So if they bought some pieces and they went, great, fantastic, as in your clients, and then 3 months later they went, okay, actually now we'd like to get some pieces for the bathroom as well, then that would be a separate transaction. But if there are multiple pieces within the transaction, then that would all be together. And if a collector, say, or a client then went, ooh, let's reduce that amount, and tried to separate it, and seemingly to keep it below the €10,000 threshold, we'd hope no one would ever do that. if they did that, that could potentially be deemed as suspicious activity because they might be trying to avoid being checked for AML.
And it's important to state as well, isn't it, that there was some misunderstanding, particularly in the art world originally, that if you did all of your transactions under the qualifying amount, you wouldn't have to do any of the registering or the paperwork, as everyone's always, you know, not, but, you know, people were trying to say, is there a way around this? There isn't. Even if you have no clients that go over that qualifying amount, you still need to register, don't you, with HMRC? So is that correct?
Well, you need to register if you absolutely anticipate that you will, because as a matter of course for your business, you do transactions at that amount. If you're a business that, let's say you're early stage, you've never had an artwork transaction that hits that level, you have no reason to register at that stage, then you wouldn't need to register. But as soon as you had a transaction happening, and remember, it's not your commission, it's the transaction value that was hitting that amount, what you do is need to register immediately. We actually asked HM Treasury about this. Treasury is responsible for writing the law and overseeing or approving the law and helping with the process. And they're also responsible for, say, approving the guidance that was published by the British Art Market Federation. And the guidance tells our sector how to interpret and abide by the law. So we asked Treasury when they had the initial consultation for the transposition of the 5th directive from the EU into UK law. We asked, well, what happens if somebody suddenly has a transaction, they've never had one at this level? And they said, well, you do need to take a realistic approach. You would conduct the due diligence that you're required to do and submit your registration as quickly as you possibly could. So that can be a bit of a balancing act if that happens, because to do the registration, you also need to do your training and have your risk assessment, your policy. So it might potentially be backwards, but what you're doing is you're essentially showing that you're doing your utmost to conduct the due diligence and to comply with the law. And when people are first becoming eligible for this, it might just be a little bit of back and forth.
Yeah. And I mean, it's something that we do regularly when we work with any client, but with interior designers, we've had clients where they brought a client that's maybe made a commitment to buy a considerable amount of work, and we've obviously then, this is where with interior designers, I always say to them, we can't, I have to have direct contact with your client. I have to know who they are. I have to have their passport and all the other paperwork that they have in order to run through the system. It can't be a kind of arm's length relationship. It's something that we need to know who it is, we need the paperwork, and we need to run it through the system to make sure we're complying with the regulations. And it's very, very important. And also, you know, it means that everything is completely transparent, you know, in terms of the process of sourcing out with clients. We know who the client is. We do the checks on behalf of the interior designer. We take over that responsibility as an art market participant and take away that concern for the interior designer who maybe feels, actually, this is a little bit more complicated than it used to be when you went to buy a work from somewhere. But they can, obviously, as you mentioned, you know, you offer a very good system, Susan, that we subscribe to, where we got our training and our policies, document support, and a secure system to register the clients on it. So there is 2 ways in which interior designers can go. They can go through that process themselves and take on that responsibility, or they can work through an advisor or similar of a similar nature to do that for them. And it just means that often, if you're working with an advisor, we'll also check, you know, the paperwork that you know is involved with buying art, and make sure the legal compliance is in place and the provenance of the work's in place, whether that's a new work or a work that's on the secondary market, because obviously we source from artist studios or auction houses or galleries, any one of them. We're making sure your paperwork's in place and it's, you know, compliant with all the legalities that are involved with buying art. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Susan, that maybe I haven't picked up on?
I've been making copious amounts of notes on what else I could add. So, because this is and the reason I say that is that this is such a big topic, and it is much more involved than people might actually realize. So one concept that Julia was talking about is know your customer. So Julia, as an art advisor who is providing art, just like a gallery would or an auction house, like she was saying, they would have an obligation to know who is ultimately that customer. I like to say know your collector. And if the ultimate intention is for an interior designer to say sell a piece to their client, as an example, this has come up absolute ton in the last several years of this being live. It wouldn't work for Julia to sell the piece to the interior designer and for them to sell it on to their client, because the ultimate client, the intention is to sell it to that end client. Now, if the intention was, let's say you have a showroom and you want to buy the piece to put in stock and have in your showroom, that's a different story. And in which case the intention is to place it in your showroom and actually the interior designer is the client. When Julia also just mentioned provenance, I'm so pleased you said that. Provenance is incredibly important. And as somebody who used to deal in both the primary and the secondary markets, I mean, I find secondary market quite scary because it's really, really vital that you are certain that you have the someone who's a specialist, ideally, to authenticate a piece. You just don't know, and if you're relying on the, let's say, the provenance records of what the seller provides, well, are they objective if the seller has provided that paperwork as well? So what that relates to is actually, in terms of provenance, is a separate piece of legislation called the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. And so you're looking not in the direction of the buyer, but you're looking in the direction of the seller. And if you end up being involved in a transaction and saying, let's say you acquire a piece and you sell it on, and it turns out to have been something that was associated or involved with the proceeds of crime, you could be criminally liable and in a lot of trouble. So it's what Julie talks about when she not only is mentioning the money laundering regulations, but the Proceeds of Crime Act. They're different pieces of legislation, but they go hand in hand. And if you look at a platform like ours, we actually have a module specifically for art and provenance, because people often want all of those records to be together. So those are my kind of 3 points to add to that.
Absolutely. And another thing that, you talked a bit about that art market participant role, and if you're involved in the brokering and kind of maybe an interior designer is talking to a gallery about work, which would make them an AMP, so, using the term. But also I have encountered interior designers who buy artwork, add a percentage and sell it to their client, that you're actually trading an art there. You're actually,
yes, you are.
And you are definitely an art, you definitely have to register if you're now doing that. I always say to clients, I give it, particularly to interior designers and architects, I give them the example of, with artwork, every time it's sold, it's not the same as a fixture and fitting. You are adding to its provenance. It's exactly the same, to give a kind of crude analogy, is with cars. You have, a first owner, a second owner, a third owner. That car logbook sticks with that car, and it tells you how many owners there have been. The artwork is exactly the same. So if you're buying artwork, adding your percentage on and selling it to the client, you're trading in art, you're a dealer, and you have to be registered with anti-money laundering to do that. When I work with an interior designer, what I do is I take a cut of the sale by negotiating a discount with the gallery, or adding it on if it's from an auction house. So what I'm doing is, it's a very clear transactional role, but I'm not adding on the value of the work, because that also affects its sale, its value. You're altering the value by doing that, but you're actually trading. So you've got to be very careful if you're buying art and then adding a percentage and selling it onto your clients. That is actually art market dealing. And that,
well, and I mean, and furthermore, what you're talking about is if I put on my little professional development hat for just a minute, I was talking about be smart about art in my intro. You were talking about having that established market price, and that's fantastic. And when somebody adds that 10%, it confuses what is the value in the first place. So it's great for what we're talking about today, for compliance and that transparency, but it's also excellent for establishing clear value and maintaining that value, and then being able to build from there.
Yeah, and it's something that interior designers need to be mindful of. I mean, I don't buy stock and resell it on. I don't deal like that. So if the budget was £10,000, I would have my 10% cut, and I'd go negotiate that discount for the client who's paying me the 10%. I don't kind of double dip from both sides. So it's important that it's a very different industry to other areas of, say, fixtures and fittings with interior design, where you can get trade discount and you can kind of recoup some of your costs in there as part of a job. It doesn't work like that in the art sector, and it's not something that can really happen without it altering the kind of value of artwork, and also effectively you becoming a dealer, which is something that obviously is incredibly subject to anti-money laundering, and you would have to be aware of. I'm just wondering, are there any questions from anyone in the audience? Is there anything that anyone would like to ask around this subject? Please just take him. If you want to ask a question, you can just come off mute and ask it rather than putting it in the chat box. Anyone? No?
Hi, Julia, I've got a question, please.
Hi, Emma.
Hiya. If you, we've kind of floated this figure, well, not floated this figure, it is a figure, 8,500 and over for the total transaction, including VAT. And then you've brought in as well, if you're buying from an art dealer, then you're adding your percentage and selling it on to your client. Effectively, you're an art dealer, so you should be registered. Does that only apply though if it's over that cap, or does it apply even if they're small works of art? What's the best way to go about it if say you're buying smaller works of art that don't cost that amount as a single transaction?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up.
Thank you.
Certainly. If all you're doing is transacting in those smaller amounts, then no. And in fact, if you, in theory, at the moment, sold a piece for say £8,500, and it was an NFT, you would not technically need to qualify. Now, some galleries that are dealing in NFTs are going ahead and conducting their compliance checks just in the spirit of the law. And I think actually there's really something to be said when you're looking at law, that it's not necessarily about picking through and going, how can I avoid it? It's working with it. And if you work with it, you work with the spirit of it. The regulator, if you were to have an intervention in say several years' time, bearing in mind they could do an intervention at any period during that 5-year time after the transaction's taken place, and you've tried to do your best, even if maybe they don't agree with your decisions, then that's great. Now, in terms of the currency amount that you mentioned, so it's really fluctuating, and actually because of what's been happening in the Ukraine, it's actually changed even more recently. So, and I was as an American, I've been looking at US exchange rates too, and I'm going, wow, that's amazing. But it's now gone all the way down to about 8,300, I believe. So it is well worth keeping an eye on what's happening with that. And just to say too, there's one other really important detail here, which is more about the responsibility of a regulated business. And that is, let's say you go, okay, I can't, like, no question. Sometimes I deal with Julia at Parapluie, but sometimes we transact directly. So we're going to need to do this. Now, if you have a transaction and it doesn't hit the threshold, or it doesn't satisfy the requirement somehow, maybe it's not a work of art either, something, but you detect suspicious activity, then you're obligated to conduct that AML check. Then you need to, even if it doesn't hit the amount. And I like to say it's when you potentially detect suspicious activity, because you typically need to go into a bit more detail before you go, okay, that is suspicious. And if you do determine that something is quote unquote suspicious activity, then you need to act very swiftly. So once you come to that conclusion, then you have a legal responsibility to act fast. But let's say somebody is not giving you information that you need because it is a qualifying transaction. Is that suspicious or is it not? Well, no, actually, they've never come across this. They're not quite sure about it. They're not quite sure about the system you're using. There's a reason behind it. If they're trying to avoid it and it gets a bit awkward and you're going, they're just not being forthcoming with this information, then you start to kind of question. And all of that comes down to taking what's called a risk-based approach, which we haven't talked about yet. And a risk-based approach is what this is all about. It's not about having a black and white checklist. It's not about actually a box ticking exercise. It's about a way of thinking. And to my mind, that's why working with people like Julia of Parapluie, who's taken it very seriously and done all the training and all of that, is really excellent, because she's taken that time and that investment to understand what that mindset is. So knowing it's not just a does this and this and this qualify, it's a does this make sense kind of situation, and then documenting the information you're collecting in the process, storing it securely, and then recording your decision making in the process.
I think it's great what you're saying. I mean, it's really comes down to a code of ethics, doesn't it? That you're making sure everybody's protected, including the people who produce the art in the first place. So it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have, and I say this as somebody who used to sell art as a living, that it really is, and Julie, I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about here. It's fabulous when you know that art is finding great homes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I just like to sleep well at night.
There's that as well.
I think we all do, Julia.
I just feel I'm too old to worry about, you know, who I'm dealing with. I mean, for me, to be honest, anti-money laundering legislation has been fantastic, because you know everyone you're dealing with, you know where the money's coming from. It's very transparent. It is unavoidable. So from that perspective, it's good. It does take a bit to get your head around. There was something Susan and I came up a while ago, a few months ago, is that obviously Susan mentioned about how each, you know, if you're a firm of 2 or 3 and you're doing that, you have to be registered to do certain, you have to have the training. Now I have, my husband's is a director of the company, but isn't involved day to day. I like to keep him, as I keep telling him, as a silent partner, and he should stay that way. But we still had to put him through the training, didn't we, Susan? Because as the other director who could step in, and he's abreast on all the business, he understands where we're at and everything, but he, although he's not dealing day to day, he is the second person to be trained, because he has to understand the implications of transactions. I guess if I was ill or there was something in that was required. So they're quite rigid. I mean, I think, did you ask HMRC about this, Susan, at the time when we weren't sure?
Yes, so there has been a lot of back and forth with HMRC about what the requirements are. And actually one thing that became very clear is that the art sector, and that I'm incorporating interior designers with that, is different without doubt to the other sectors that they already regulated. And in fact, we were told at one stage by the HMRC sector lead for art market participants that it's more complicated than any other sector that he had dealt with. And just all the complexities potentially of art transactions. And essentially what it comes down to in the end is having training that is in alignment with their level of responsibility and their, say, role with AML. So if someone was, in your case, the silent director, and it's actually an incredibly common business setup, which I didn't realize, but there are lots of small art businesses out there and interior design businesses where you have often a couple. One of them is the active one, the other one is silent, as Julia is talking about. What that person would have a responsibility, firstly, to be registered as a responsible person. Directors and company secretaries cannot get out of that. They have to be registered. And then there's that responsibility for training. They could go through the training that comes complete with certification, a certificate of completion, such as that with ArtAML, or it might be that the business determines, okay, actually that person doesn't need to go through the full training course, but what we're going to do is an internal training course, because our view is that is in alignment with their level of responsibility. But it all needs to be documented, and it does actually need to be still a formal internal session where that person understands what they need to and has, let's say, access to everything that is required in the case that you need your plan B, is how I often talk about it with business. When it comes to AML, you don't want to just have one person with all of the responsibility if there is a plan B by any way. Ideally, you will have a nominated officer and a deputy nominated officer. I've been running business for nearly 20 years. I know sometimes things happen you weren't anticipating. And so when you're talking about a topic like this, having somebody else who can step in if necessary, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. And could you just run through again, Susan, about obviously the deadline for registering with HMRC was June last year, 2021, although before that, there was an earlier date of January 2020 when you were expected to start registering your purchases or buying art on behalf of people or brokering and negotiating. So technically, if any of that's been happening since then and you're not registered, that's something to be mindful of. But could you talk about how, I think you touched on it a little bit at the end, just to reiterate what HMRC now will do if you're not registered and you are transacting in this arena?
So you would, let's say HMRC contacts your business and they ask you, have you been transacting at this level in works of art? And if the answer is yes, then their question is, starting from the 10th of January 2020, which was the date the law became effective, that was the number 1511 2019 Act. So that, it was an amendment to the Act. It would be the date of the first qualifying transaction of works of art since the 10th of January 2020 is when you should have been registered, and HMRC would fine your business £5,000 per quarter from that point.
Mm.
And if you then paid within 28 days, they would, when you received the fine, they would reduce the penalty by 25%. And if you instead go, my gosh, I should have registered, and you get in touch with HMRC and you say, I've realized I'm an art market participant, I need to register my business, you'll need to declare when the date of the first qualifying transaction was. Now, if that isn't, say, from this point forwards, if there was something in the past, you would have that fine, except it would be reduced by 50% per quarter. And the other point here as well is that the interventions are really starting properly from the new financial year, so from 6th of April 2022. It's not to say they haven't been getting in touch with people. In fact, we've seen over a period of time, it's been quite interesting, the kind of I guess the rigorous nature of the application process. It's called registration. I like to call it application because you can be rejected as an art market participant. It's over time, they've done more and more and more. So kind of earlier on, when you signed up, if you said you had your training and your risk assessment, your policy and everything, they probably wouldn't check. But starting in about September of 2021, we became aware that HMRC was beginning to request, say, the documents that were being required. So we were getting contacted by some very panicked art dealers saying, what on earth is a risk assessment? What on earth is policy? Apparently I have to have this thing called policies, controls, procedures. And we were able to help them. They weren't trying to avoid anything. They just didn't understand what they were. And now you fast forward today, another 8 months beyond, or 9 months beyond that, I guess, yeah, 7, 8 months. And now they're about to start full interventions. And I think one of the problems that we have with this is that you had a law go into place. It was immediately followed by the pandemic. The deadline to register was actually delayed from January of 2021 to June of 2021. And now here we all are. And I think a lot of art businesses are going, well, nothing's happened yet, so it's okay. But actually, that's not the case. The reality is that HMRC did quite rightly say, okay, we need to let these people sort out their businesses first and foremost. They didn't have the opportunity to learn about the sector. The actual art market participant department is working very hard to understand the industry, to be able to not have something in place that prevents these businesses, your businesses, from being able to transact. They're not trying to have any impact economically, but what they are doing is trying to prevent crime. And so they finally now are having an opportunity to go out and visit the art fairs and to better understand the sector. And we've been trying to help those people running it. They're not the people you'll talk with if you call HMRC, but we're talking with people at the top saying, for this sector, and saying, here's how it works. Here are challenges people are being faced. How can we troubleshoot this so that you can work with these businesses so that they're able to be compliant, but not making it impossible for them to do their work. So it's really been this, it's been a really peculiar implementation period because of the pandemic, and it doesn't mean that we're not going to see headlines at some point. We will, and people who receive fines will actually be published on gov.uk as well.
Thanks, Susan. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask myself or Susan? No? Does it come across as quite clear? It's hard to see. I can't see people's faces. So hard to know whether we've bored them into submission or whether it's something that seems quite apparent.
No, it's really useful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Really good.
I mean, it is. I mean, it does sound quite intimidating. And to be honest, when you first get engaged with it, I was quite, you know, although I really welcomed the regulations and the kind of transparency, making sure you've sort of got your ducks aligned and everything's in place is quite, it's not intimidating working with Susan, but it's intimidating in terms of what the implications are if you don't comply. But I think it's like anything, it's something that you become accustomed to over time. I think because particularly in my field, we're always checking the legality of work. If someone's actually, you know, actually has title to sell an artwork, you know, and where it's come from, and you know, there's so many legal aspects of buying art that we do on a daily basis that I'm kind of quite used to it, but it's still something else to get our heads around and understand a bit further in terms of buying art that obviously now has implications for the interior design sector, which might not have, I suspect isn't apparent to interior designers. I don't know if you've heard of it before or not, which is what I suspected from my conversations with interior designers recently.
And Julia and I've been really concerned about it, actually, particularly now that we've been getting news about the fines, because there's just quite understandably, if an interior design business saw this term art market participant, I can absolutely see why they wouldn't necessarily go, oh, that's me. They wouldn't think that. So,
I've never heard of it before today.
And a lot of people don't realize they're acting as dealers, you know, because it's quite common in interior design to buy something at trade discount and, you know, add your percentage on and sell it on again, and that is altering the provenance and dealing. So it is another implication that people aren't aware of.
Yeah, and what I would say is spread the word, let your colleagues know.
Yeah. We're going to obviously we're recording now, and we'll keep this. I'll probably post it onto our website and share some links, and maybe Susan can do the same, and we can always run more if people are interested, or you get a sense that you have colleagues who aren't aware about this.
And actually, it might be worth noting as well, Julia, on an international art market basis, obviously the three largest art markets are the US, China, and the UK. And the US is not set to implement anything equivalent in the near future. So for those of you who are working with US colleagues, whether they're galleries or art dealers or advisors or interior designers, they don't have this. And for international transactions, it can actually make it more complicated when they don't have that obligation, but you do. And then that means you're requesting information. They might be able to turn around and say, not going to give that to you, go away. And you go, well, what on earth do I do? And there's no easy solution for it. And we think it will be at least a few years before the US has anything come on board. The different sanctions environment that we find ourselves in could potentially change that in the States. And no business in the UK, the US, the EU, and most countries are actually allowed to transact with sanctioned individuals or sanctioned businesses. Yeah. So that's a simplistic way of saying it, but there is an existing obligation, but it's separate to AML.
Yeah, that came about in the HMRC sanctions Zoom I was on about a week ago. That, you know, it does actually impact, particularly in terms of Russian sanctions and other sanctioned individuals in other countries, which is something that when you run people through a system, then you get to understand if they are, because nobody has a great big sign around their neck.
No,
Saying, you know, so actually that is one fortuitous thing, you know, thing about running people through the system, is that you then know whether you can work with individuals or not. So I mean, so that's important, but it does apply in Europe, doesn't it? Because it is the EU anti-money laundering legislation, so it's European and UK. So you know, that's also important to think about, because it applies to a lot of other different countries.
That's right. Yeah, and interestingly, we've come across some EU businesses that need to comply that didn't realize it. So there's been much more publicity about this in the UK, even though the news hadn't got to interior designers yet.
Yeah. So we'll keep this recorded session and we'll share it. But please do spread the news with your colleagues about this issue, and we can always, you know, signpost them to help, or they can talk to Susan and I directly to give advice. But we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.